This video recording is being made on January 16th, 2015 at Pro Video, located at 8170 Cholla Avenue in Yucca Valley, California. The purpose is to interview Catherine Davis, who is from an early family in the Morongo Basin. Present here at this interview are, say your name,
Catherine Davis,
Bob Stevenson, Bob Connors,
and Cheryl Nan Curvis. This record is a part of the Morongo Basin Historical Society Oral History Project. Do you, Catherine Davis, give permission to include this oral interview in this project?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Please give us your full name and where you were born.
Well, my full name is Catherine Jean Gray Davis, and I was born in Oakland, California.
Okay. We would like to find out more about your family history to start this interview. Who are your parents, and do you have any brothers or sisters?
Yes, my parents were Helen Gray and Everett Gray. My sister is Barbara Smith, and she lives in Northern California.
And where did you grow up?
In Southern California, all over Southern California. We moved from Downey to Olive View, and it's a sanatorium in San Fernando Valley, and then moved to Arcadia as my father was finally moved to a position as the CEO of the Los Angeles County General Hospital.
Wow, that's very exciting. How about your personal life, your husband, your children?
Well, my husband was my high school sweetheart, and he was born in Claremont, or lived in Claremont, California, and we went to high school together, and then he graduated ahead of me and went to West Point. And after he got out of West Point and into the service, why, we were married and moved to Japan, where my daughter was born, Sharon Davis. And we were there for about a year and a half, and then moved to, various places in the United States. We covered Fort Sill, Oklahoma several times, and El Paso, Texas several times. Then when the Korean War broke out, he was sent over to Korea, and when that was over with, he came back, and we were sent to Austria. And we had a son born in Oklahoma, one born in Austria, Salzburg, and then came back to the States. And my husband got out of the service and went into civilian life. And he worked for Westinghouse, and then we were sent back to, we wanted to live in California, so that's why one reason we came back here. But he was sent then to be the Southeastern District Manager for the Westinghouse Bryant section in Atlanta, Georgia. And we had a son born there. And we had no other children after that.
That's good. Okay, now let's focus on the Morongo Basin and what brought your family here.
All right. My father and mother retired, and they came out to Joshua Tree to decide what they wanted to do from there. They enjoyed the area, and they built their own home on a 5-acre tract. And they thought it was too hot to live in Joshua Tree all the time, so they hadn't tried it yet, but they moved up to Oregon for the hot weather and went camping for part of a year, and decided they liked Elk Lake, Oregon, and they built a cabin up there on the lake. They decided later that it was pretty nice in the desert, and they weren't sure they wanted to stay up in the mountains all the time. So they came back to Joshua Tree and stayed in their home, and had been sailors in the past all their lives, and they decided they should get a motor sailor and maybe go over the East Coast down to Florida and get started in pursuing a purchase of a motor sailor. They did that. They went to the Northeast, and they found the boat that they would like, and they bought it and hired a captain, a young fellow that could take them down the inland waterway, because they had not sailed on the ocean in this boat to any extent. And he sailed them down through the New York Harbor, and then they took it down the inland waterway themselves down to Florida. And they stayed in Fort Lauderdale in the wintertime, and then they came back to Joshua Tree, and they did that for several years, about 3 years, and sailed to the Bahamas, went through the Bermuda Triangle by mistake, and had a big surprise when their boat turned around in a 180-degree turn just at the flick of an eyelash. And fortunately, they had it on automatic pilot. Too bad that wouldn't have happened had they not done that. But my dad was down below checking the motor, and my mother was in the galley, so nobody went overboard. And he rushed up and turned off the automatic pilot, and they sailed on to the Bahamas. Wow. But they had a really enjoyable several years with their boat, and my dad thought he was getting too old for this, so he said it'll take several years probably to sell the boat, so we'll just put it on the market, and it sold that very winter.
Oh, wow. So what year are we talking about that they, or approximately, that they built their home in Joshua Tree?
Oh, they started, let's see, they built it about 1948, I think.
Okay.
And we used to come out from Claremont and visit them a lot, and of course got bitten by the desert bug too.
That was my second question. What brought your family here?
Well, when Ralph got out of the service, we thought, well, we'll go up to Northern California and start in a business up there of some kind. So he was selling real estate, and it didn't go well because it was a bad time in real estate, as those things come and go. And his brother was working for the Los Angeles Times, and he suggested that he get a job with them. And so he did, and he was selling advertising for the midwinter section that the Times used to put out. And it was a really nice position, but it didn't last because they cut out the midwinter edition.
Oh.
And then we moved out here, and he started selling real estate in Joshua Tree, and later decided that he'd rather be in appraising, and he followed that training and became a real estate appraiser, and that was why we lived here all these years.
Good. Now, you mentioned earlier that your father was involved as a CEO of the Los Angeles Hospital?
County General Hospital.
County General Hospital. So did he have any participation with the High Desert Medical Center? Was he involved with that?
Yes. He and my mother both were active in the works that went into combining the two hospitals of 29 Palms and Yucca Valley. And he was a board member on the first board of the combined hospitals.
Any idea the time frame of that?
Well, I could look it up,
Okay.
but
I had some notes, and I just want to verify. It was 1967. I see that he was the vice president, and then 1969 he was president. Does that sound
I think so.
about right?
Uh-huh.
So that gives us
Yes.
The time when they merged and,
Right.
and became the hospital that's now in Joshua Tree?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, how about your mother? I understood that she was very involved in the hospital auxiliary.
Yes. She, as they got the hospital built, then she helped with the cleaning up of the rooms. They did everything. She joined the auxiliary in the corps that they started out with just worked day and night to get the hospital do anything they could, just rolled up their sleeves and did everything they could to get it ready for occupancy.
And this was all volunteer.
Oh, yes.
I love that story. I love the grassroots that people did get involved and get their, the elbow grease, as they call it. What spurred your mom on to the Helen Gray Education Center?
Oh, well, that was really interesting. They were doing these all these little projects that they could to raise money for the hospital, and then they'd find out what the doctors wanted and needed, if it was equipment or just anything, and they would give them the money to get these things. They bought one of the other things besides medical equipment. They bought the automatic doors for the entrance to the hospital, and they really put out a lot of money for all of these things. And so they were really trying hard to earn money for the hospital, but they got to the point where they didn't know what else the hospital could use, and it was sort of a blank wall. They asked the doctors what they would like, and they said, well, we could maybe use a hot dog cooker for our our lunches and so on. And they thought, well, we're working so hard, we don't want to buy them a hot dog cooker. And about that time, she became aware that there was a regional Southern California organization for volunteer people, organizations in the hospitals. So she started looking into that, and she checked with some of the other volunteers in the other hospitals, and there was the annual get-together for the volunteers was coming up, and they were having a big convention in Los Angeles, and so they all discussed this and thought, well, maybe we should go and find out what we don't know, So they did. I think there were quite a few of them that paid their own way and went in there, and they were divided into various groups, and they there'd be 2 or 3 of them mixed in with other hospitals, and they'd have discussions at these round tables. And they got so many ideas. And then they had the final get-together, and Beverly Sills spoke to them, the opera singer. And she had so many ideas for helping hospitals, and it just made a wonderful impression on all of them. So they came back and they discussed this, and they were all very enthusiastic and ready to really get in there and do some really real work for this hospital. So she went around to, Helen went around to these various organizations locally, like one in Corona, local hospitals, one in Colton, I think. And they talked about what they were doing and planned to do, and my goodness, they were building, I think it was in Corona, had just finished building a senior care, not a care center, but a residence for seniors. And just like Yucca Valley has now just finished here in Yucca. And she found out other things that they had done. They had continuing care buildings, some of the others had put money toward, and they also had learned that the best money-making project that they knew of was a thrift shop. And so all these things were brought up at the next meeting, and everything was laid out for the members to think about, talk about, and vote on. And then they all decided, another thing, one had built this auditorium and it was a healthcare building where they could have their own organizational things such as fashion shows and so on to raise money. But they also could use it for the communities, and the whole communities became interested in what could be done. So they all voted on it, and they decided that the auditorium was the thing that they wanted to do. So it wasn't just her idea, it was the whole group. And they worked long and hard and really put their backs into the whole plan. And it took them, I believe, 7 years from the beginning to the fruition. And they changed the site once because it was going to be up across from the continuing care building, and they had a groundbreaking up there, and they were all ready to go. And then the plan changed, and it was too far, they said, from the hospital. It wasn't convenient for their own use. So they filled in dirt at that point where they would have enough land to really build the building there. It didn't look like it at first, but it worked out. And they had some great architects, and they had the hospital, the board, and the everyone organized within the hospital was all behind this. And they gradually got the money. They put the money in with the hospital's money, but it was kept in a separate accounting, and she kept track of it all the time. And nothing went awry. It just, in every meeting with the builders, the contractors, the hospital, and the architects, everything. She sat in all of those meetings, and nothing got wiped out without her knowledge.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And one of the main things she wanted was to have the partitions within the building insulated to the point where they were to be movable, so they could open the thing up. They wanted them insulated so that no sound would go through from one to the other when they were having various meetings. And she was a stickler to all these things, and it all was carried out just as it should be. So it finally came to fruition. I used to take her down while they were building it. I'd take her down there, and we could get in the back door usually, and we'd turn over an empty paint barrel and she'd sit on it, and she'd look out the windows across the desert and just think how wonderful this would be for the community. And it was just one of the happiest times that she had.
I guess. How did they determine that it would be named the Helen Gray
Oh,
Education
that was
Center?
a big shock to her. It was when they first announced they'd have the groundbreaking at the original site. And they were having a big meeting, and I believe it was Ernie Littlepage was heading up the auxiliary at that time. And so he stood up there and he announced that this was groundbreaking was going to take effect and take place a certain day. And they had a little luncheon, and they were kind of congratulating themselves about how it had come along and everything. And he said, well, we have an important announcement to make. We have a name picked out for this. And he said it's going to be called the Helen Gray Health Education Center. And she just almost fell off the chair. She was so surprised. And I told her she'd have to behave herself now that they'd named this after her. If she went to jail or something, it would be a real disaster.
Oh. Any estimation as to how many hours she put in every week at the thrift store, or?
No, they did list it. 7,000 and something, but
Wow.
but she never even put in half the hours she worked.
Oh.
It wasn't the important thing to her.
Like a lot of our volunteers
Right,
here in the
right.
Morongo Basin. They love to give. Well, I understood that from some of my research that before this building was built, they had one room in the hospital itself that had to serve as the doctor's lounge. It had to serve as the board meeting room. It had to serve some other community, like the United Way met there, Alcoholics Anonymous, Morongo Unified School District's ROV programs. And so to move it out of there frees up a lot of space for the hospital as well.
Oh, yes, uh-huh.
I didn't know if you'd had any input on that or if you were aware.
Well, I know that was the fact that they were really hurting for space, and it did get freed up, but the auxiliary itself, they met in a closet. That's where they were meeting.
Whoops. Uh-oh. Covering it. Okay.
It's kind of muffled.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right. Well, let's see. What other notes do I have? I also saw one quote. You were saying she was pretty much hands-on and part of all of the different meetings with architects, etc. And I understood she told the architect, "I want you to design a pretty building because it doesn't cost any more than an ugly building."
She probably did say that. That sounds like her, but no, I didn't. She hadn't told me that, and I wasn't there.
Thought that was a great quote. I loved
yes,
it.
Excellent.
And that was probably way before she knew her name was going to be on it.
Oh,
so.
she had no idea. I mean, that was the furthest thing from her mind.
That's a lovely surprise and such a
It really was. It was
nice story. Now I understand the building is used for a lot of education classes. I know I've been there for special events and other things. So it's the hospital foundation housed in there, and I think some of the marketing folks are in there. So I bet she would be very pleased.
Oh, she would be.
That.
She would be.
When did we lose her?
In 1995, I think it was August 28th, and she was in the continuing care building up there. She suddenly had a turn for the worst and had gone to the hospital, and then things weren't looking good, and they sent her up there. And as soon as she got up there, the auxilians would come by and they'd say, "Well, we're having a problem with this," and she was so interested to hear and suggest how they might do something about it, you know. And they all kind of kept a quiet, sort of distant watch on her from the time she went up there. And after about 2.5 weeks, she passed away.
Oh. But she did get to see a lot going on in the building.
Oh, she did, yes. And at one time, I didn't think she was going to live till the hospital and the contractors and everybody got into an agreement and got it all built. But they did, and they had her birthday was August 2nd, and they had a birthday party for her in there. Oh. And she just really loved it. She was just so pleased. But she always said it was because of what everybody did working together, and it wasn't her. It was just, you know, she would watch to see that things were being built as they had planned and do those things. But she said it was everybody's efforts that developed it, and they were so enthusiastic about it. And it was, she had done volunteer things before, and had developed the Girl Scouts in Arcadia. They didn't have, when we lived there, they didn't have any Girl Scout troops at all. And Pasadena was just starting theirs. That's how old I've gotten now. And so we were starting in Scouts, or wanted to, and so she said, "Well, we'll have to start a troop." So she went to Pasadena and talked to the ladies there. And they had been trained by President Hoover's wife, who had been the president of the Girl Scouts of America. While he was president, she had been working with the Girl Scouts. So she knew those ladies that learned from her, and they lived in Palo Alto because he was the president of Stanford at that time. And she learned from those ladies what the basic plan for Girl Scouts was, and she put it into effect in Arcadia and started doing things to arrange for developing the troops by earning money, and we weren't selling cookies in those days or anything. But we lived in an area that had some nice gardens, and so she asked some of the people that lived there if they would let some of the girls give garden tours, and enough families came together or women to do that, and if she said, now if you don't know the names of the flowers and so on, the plants, the key ones, well, the girls need to know that or they can't really give a tour. So would you go over it with them? I mean, these were young girls. They were under 10. And they said, oh, well, yes, we can do that, or our gardener can. So that's what happened. They went over those things. And the tour was handled very well, and the girls were the ones that participated and guided the people through the gardens. And she did some other things to get like a Girl Scout house. There was the school had an old cottage-style house across the street that was all run down, and it belonged to them, and they just used it to store old things in. And she asked the principal if the girls could use that if they were meeting in the basement of the school for their meetings, and it wasn't very nice, and she thought they should be out off the school ground as much as possible. And he said, oh, well, that isn't good enough for them. And she said, oh, they can clean it up. That's something they can do. So he said, well, all right, if they want it, they can have it. And he got in trouble with his wife because she had a troop of girl guides, bluebirds they were.
Oh, campfire.
And she hadn't thought to ask him for the building.
Oh.
So the girls had a place like that, and still she wasn't satisfied. And she said, we have to really make a name for these girls, and maybe we can have a gymkhana. And, it was in Arcadia, and the racetrack was there, and there were horsey people around. And so they did start she found a lot where they could set up a corral and some seats and so on. And she got people interested. The community would give, for prizes at a horse show, they would give, they gave a radio or different, little one, or something that the girls would like to have, the young people would like to have. And but she said, this isn't enough. We have to really have something to advertise it. So they had a horse at the racetrack called Malicious, and he was the star of every race because he would be way, way at the back, and he kind of guided himself in races, and the jockey was just there to see that all went well. And he would always be last as he was coming around till he got to the far turn, and then you'd hear the announcer say, well, here comes Malicious. And he would come nose by nose, up through the ranks, and he usually won. So he was retiring. So she thought, well, if he's retiring, I'm going to go talk to his owner and see if we can borrow him for the gymkhana. I mean, she would think of things that nobody else would think could even happen at all. It was just a real oddity almost that she could come up with these things. Mm-hmm. So she went over to the racetrack and found out the owner's name was Mrs. Urban, and she got in to see her and told her what she wanted and said, could we just possibly borrow him for the afternoon, and your trainer could walk him around the ring. And she said, I know we'd have a big sellout if we could do that. And she said, well, that would be all right, but she said all the horses have to leave Santa Anita the day before this gymkhana was coming. And Mother said, well, if she said, we have a stable with a couple of horses. If we put him in our stable, could we do it? And she said, well, I don't see anything wrong with that. So she brought him up to the stable, and the next day he went down there to the gymkhana, and he was a wonderful horse. he loved the audiences, and he just would prance around, and at the request of his handler, he'd do anything. And then he went off to his retirement, which was in a special pasture down in near the Riviera Country Club somewhere. And we made a big killing on the the gymkhana, and the Girl Scouts were in the newspaper, and it was just. Then we moved away, so I don't know what happened to him there.
I tell you, it sounds like your mother would never take no for an answer.
Well, she didn't mind asking, and
That's good.
And, yeah, and she got these ideas. Like when they got their first thrift shop in Joshua Tree, they bought this little house that was behind Jerry's restaurant there on the highway, and they started the thrift shop, and they got so much business and everything that they needed a bigger place. And so she saw that the place where they are now on Park Boulevard was vacant, and it was for sale. But they didn't have that much money. And so I know she asked my husband, she said, "Do you think that they would take our house there and trade? And we could move our thrift shop over there. That'd be a much better location." He said, "Oh, no, they wouldn't do that." And finally she said, "Well, I think I'll ask them." So she did, and they did it.
Oh, wow. Love it.
So, she didn't mind trying. And that was her way of always doing her volunteer work, by getting very down to the basic part, so she knew what was going on, and then showing people that were interested what needed to be done, and letting them decide what, as a group, what they wanted to do. And it just always made a very vivacious organization.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like she was a wonderful lady. I'm sorry I didn't get to know her, but she sure did make a difference in our
yeah.
community. And that's part of why it's so important to get this story down for the future generations, so they can see who built this place,
Yeah.
and made it such a great place to live.
Well, that really was not her aim. Her aim was just to do what she could. It wasn't to do any big grand thing. It was just to get in there and do things.
That hospitals are vitally important, for a community, and so that's wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about her?
Well, I don't think you have time for any more.
Sounds like she was a lovely person, and
a hard worker, and she'd do anything. It wasn't too difficult or something she didn't want to do.
She wasn't afraid to ask.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good lesson for all of us. Worst they can do is say no, I guess.
That's
right. Okay, Kathy, I guess that's it for now. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Appreciate
and
your
thank
time.
you for your interest in what she did, because it was certainly worthwhile for the community, I think.
It sure was.
This is my mother. She was born in 1899 in Oakland, August 2nd. She had two older brothers, and they kind of gave her a hard time, but she learned to be a good sport, and she was the best sport I ever knew, because she could just put up with most anything and take the light side of it.
Okay.
And this is how she looked when she graduated from college. She and her friend went out and bought, they sold some of their worldly goods so they could pay to have their pictures taken for their graduation. Everett Gray, he was born in Oakland in 1895, and he went through the World War I, was buried alive by a shell, and he was left outside the tent as those that they weren't going to try and resuscitate. But a friend came by who was in his unit and thought he recognized him from college, so he moved him into another tent, and he got to the hospital in France and survived all that, and was ready to go again.
Okay.
This is this was at an auxiliary fashion show. That's Helen. She was a model in that, and it was over at the country club in the old golf course.
Okay.
This is the result of winning a flight in a glider by a friend, and no, the friend didn't want to fly in a glider, but Helen did, and she enjoyed it immensely. Dr. Cups was the pilot. Building at the end of the construction for the Helen Gray Education Center. I didn't realize that was on there. This is when they were at the when she first had experience living near a hospital and being a part of it. This was the county pork farm where Everett was the assistant superintendent back in 1929. And they had a bad earthquake. It was 1932 when the earthquake in Long Beach. 300 patients were moved out of the building into the street. Everett was assistant superintendent of the county poor farm in Downey. It was called Rancho Los Amigos. And that was during the Depression, and people were taken care of at that hospital. And these are 300 patients that were moved out into the street because the brick buildings were too dangerous for them to remain in. Contribution to the Gymkhana for the Girl Scouts in Arcadia to create enough interest to perpetuate the Girl Scout movement in the area. That's Malicious, the racehorse. This is Helen and Everett Gray in 1982. And that's the home they had built. It's up above where the hospital finally landed, which was a surprise to them. This was taken in Boise, Idaho in 1986, when we went up there to our daughter's wedding. And mother was 87. She was a year older than the year. This was, I think this was the same year. And this was on her 93rd birthday at Rock Band, their home on Stony Crest Road, and she's enjoying a photograph album that was gotten together for her birthday. That was in 1992. Oh, this was on the road going to the groundbreaking where they were all going to pick up a shovel and break ground for the education center when it was to be across from the continuing care center. And this is Rock Band, their home, they grew it from a cabin to a rambling home. And it just had to nestle among the rocks. In fact, one rock comes into the house because there wasn't room unless you added a rock in it, I guess. Oh, this is their boat in 1963. It's the Irish Mist at Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And that's the one that they sailed to the Bahamas and several times and enjoyed snorkeling and just generally enjoyed the area. And they had a brush with the Bermuda Triangle. And this is a picture that was in the Florida paper of Helen and Everett in their boat, taken in Fort Lauderdale. And this was taken the day before the big celebration at the Helen Gray Education Center, when it was completed after 7 years.
Wow.
The last picture taken of her, I believe. California Legislature Assembly resolution that was presented to Helen at the Helen Gray Education Center, commending her for the various points of development that she had put forth to establish the building.